consume and become more and more difficult, harder and harder to find places to get nourishment for your food. But now the nutrients from your soil, from your land, aren't being rotated in the crop rotation from planting different things for different seasons. All you're doing, for example, is plant, and I'm generalizing here quite a bit, but just to give you sort of a holistic understanding, all I'm planting is, for example, coffee, and the ground eventually runs fallow. That doesn't present a problem to the individual that is paying you, because he just goes to another farm and purchases the rights to grow the cash crop on another farm. And we, in turn, have massive, massive food shortages, right? And the food shortage comes as a consequence of converting what were otherwise very well functioning consumption or subsistence farms into cash farms for cash crops, right? So it seems pretty, at surface, it seems like it wouldn't represent much of a threat to food security. But one of the gravest threats to food security is actually the transition from the wholesale, not just individual transition, but the wholesale transition from subsistence consumption farming to cash crop farming, right? For any number of reasons: failure to rotate crops, fallowness of the land, failure to produce food in order to subsist one's life. So the distinction between subsistence and cash crop farming is an enormous threat to the rights that individuals have with respect to food security. And the whole point of me putting this out there for sort of information consumption, right? I cook up information for the masses to eat. The whole point of me putting this information out there for consumption is to get a larger awareness and also subsequent discussion with respect to the distinction between consumption and subsistence farming on the one hand, and cash crops, cash farming on the other. I think more people need to start talking about it, make a YouTube video, throw your 2 cents into the discussion. It's a shame that there's only one video. At least I was only able to find one video on the topic in all of YouTube. So what ends up happening, how this sort of transition from consumption, subsistence farming to cash crop farming happens, is that there is a change in the emerging market demand, right? And I'm not going to get into the technical economic aspect of it, but E-M-E-R. Right? There's a demand somewhere, right? The people and international commodities, securities, brokers, fill in the blank, look and trade basically on speculations, right? We think that coffee demand is going to be high, much higher in, let's say, the winter than it is in the summer. So insofar as we think, fourth quarter demand for, this is really how the discussion happens, right? Insofar as we think fourth quarter demand for coffee within, let's say, for example, the United States is going to be very high, and it probably will be very high because of want, because of you need a little pep in order to do whatever it is you're doing, and not so much in the summer. Then we need to make sure that our quotas can be met, that they're a bit higher in the third quarter than they are in, let's say, the second quarter. Right, quarters, you break the year down into quarters. And based on that demand, the emerging demand, the projections for demand, these demands and these projections are then sent to whoever the wholesalers are. They go in and they raise quotas, and obviously they, if they're a good company, they pay the farmers a little bit more in order to meet higher expectations. But insofar as the farmers make a little bit more, their land also, the land, right? Think about this now, right? The land itself, the ground itself, based on the emerging market demands, the land, and I think this is really cool when you think of it in this sense, right? The land braces, literally the earth, and I'm not trying to sound like I hate the word tree hugger, but I don't want to sound like a tree hugger, but in a sense, right? It's the emerging market demand is literally placed in the land, right? So the demand for higher quotas of coffee bean, for example, means that the land, the physical ground, is going to bear the burden insofar as it has to produce more of the coffee bean in order to support the demand. And we're not just talking about coffee, right? We're talking about sugar, we're talking about rice, we're talking about wheat, we're talking about coffee, we're talking about corn, we're talking about, you name it, right? Various commodities that, and consumption crops here that are cash crops there. Okay, so the emerging market demand is going to place a burden, a very physical, real, ecological burden on the land. Number two, market demands place expectations, burdens on primarily third world agriculturists, not entirely, but primarily third world agriculturists, to convert their subsistence consumption crops into cash crops. And I'll talk about that conversion. So there's a demand. That demand is translated to the particular farmer. That demand is transferred from the farmer to the particular land, right? And then the land is expected, in a sense, to provide the crop, whatever the crop is, right? Crop X. And that crop is then exported, and is exported for profit. And then the cycle continues. New demands, new expectations on the farmer, new expectations on the land. The crops are produced, they're exported, creates more money, and you just continue the cycle. You continue the cycle, you continue the cycle. And what ends up happening? Well, we recognize that capital increases, right? There's an increase in capital, for sure. The worker has to work more, right? And the land, the expectation of the land is that, you know, the land can only produce so much, right? So you see time and time again problems of fallow land, desertification, lost resources, and people move from one area to another. They have to migrate between areas in the worst case scenario, because the land is no longer fertile, right? The land has been completely depleted of the nutrients that it has. And we have, in its worst case, an expanding, now this is really sort of, you know, end of the world sort of analysis. It's not science fiction, it actually happens, but it is worst case scenario. You have, as an indirect consequence of the emerging market demands based on sort of capitalist projections, the desertification of more and more of the world, right, to meet those demands. Because enough crop rotation doesn't occur, and there is just an expectation and a demand, and it needs to be met, and it needs to be met right now, right? But when we're talking about the Earth doesn't operate that way, right? And this is where, you know, a far more intelligent sort of ecological science professor needs to come in and talk about the ways in which, and the time needed in order for the land to replenish its nutrients and stuff, because I just don't really know how much time that takes. But obviously, as far as the demands are concerned, it takes more time than the demand, right? The demand is, we need these crops now. The argument is, we need more time in order to let the land rejuvenate itself, and they're like, no, push it to the limit. The land is pushed beyond its capacity, and the land invariably becomes fallow. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, fields are gradually converted from subsistence consumption crops to cash crops, which also often leads to mass famine and starvation. And I've given you references, several references, so just click any of those links. They'll take you to pages and websites and articles that specifically refer to this mass famine and mass starvation as a consequence of attempting to meet the sort of external emerging market demands on cash crops. So, huge problem. Okay, the next thing that we can look at with respect to food as a human right are approaches to ceasing starvation and malnutrition. How do we go about doing this? Approaches to ceasing starvation and malnutrition. So what are some of the approaches to ceasing starvation and malnutrition? Okay, November 16th, 1974, WFC, the World Food Conference, held the Universal Declaration on the Eradication of Hunger and Malnutrition. And here's some of what was stated. Every man, woman, and child has an inalienable right. Every man, woman, and child has an inalienable right to be free from hunger and malnutrition.